is the pain relieving effect of nandrolone mediated by other mechanisms other than its role as a progestin, i.e. does it have any kind of unique opioid or anti-inflammatory functions outside of just increasing fluid in the joint?
There's no question that nandrolone does have a significant joint pain relief. One of them that I don't know if this is the reason or not, that it increases synovial fluid. Even though it's not equal, I tend to start by reducing the testosterone dose by about 50, 60 milligrams, and then adding nandrolone at 60 milligrams. And then it's about the same thing we always do, titrate the dose of nandrolone up, if necessary, to ease the joint pain. I think one of the main things that people are so worried about estrogen, I don't think they need to be. So then I was going to go into another one of my methodologies that has worked really well for me over the decades with dealing with estrogen is the use of nandrolone. So now what I can do is I can pull your testosterone dose back to whatever does not cause an estrogenic side effect. Different studies that say that nandrolone converts to 0 to 20% to estradiol that testosterone does. I've found that it actually probably is closer to 0. So what I can do is give people testosterone at a dose that doesn't cause estrogenic side effects. But usually, sometimes for people who are sensitive, that's not enough testosterone. They need more androgens in their blood. They need more androgen receptor agonization. So now we can just pop nandrolone on top of that, and there's no estrogenic side effects, and people do really well on that. I mean, do you notice the same issue, and what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I'll kind of share all my tricks of the trade, and absolutely, I'd be very happy if you steal that and any others, because I think one thing that we both have in common is we're both trying to educate as much as possible in this space. Because my goal is if we can get as many people with properly optimized testosterone protocols as possible all over the world, and I can only see so many people a day before my eyes start to bleed from the computer screen.
Yeah,
I'd like to ask you a bunch of stuff about nandrolone that I've been wanting to ask someone for a long time, but I haven't met anyone who's really clued into it in terms of not just being like, oh yeah, when you give it to someone, this happens, in terms of being like, what's actually happening and why. But in terms of the stuff that you brought up there, the really important point that you brought up is that a lot of the problems that people have when they start TRT is because your hormones went from here to here really, really quick. And I like to mitigate that by kind of coming in with a dose that I refer to like, okay, we're going to start you off with like a single shot cappuccino, then we'll move it up to like a double shot flat white, and then we're going to move it up to a triple espresso. We're not just going to go straight for the triple espresso. So dose titration can be really important. But when I started TRT almost a decade ago, and this was, I think Jay Campbell had just put his first book out. There was maybe the Excel Mail forum had started, but there was nothing on YouTube. And that's one of the reasons I got into making content, because I just tried to make what I was looking for many years ago. But at least the benefit of that was that there wasn't a whole bunch of stuff that you could just go down like doom scrolling and just screw yourself up with anxiety with. You just kind of had to like trust the process. And my doctor said to me when I started my protocol, and granted, it was 250 milligrams every 10 days with half a milligram of Rimadex twice a week and an HCG, which was not a good place to start. But what he did say in his defense is he goes, when you start your treatment, if you have any side effects at your first follow-up, we'll talk about it. And he was basically saying that this is going to be an adjustment phase. And at the moment, I see a lot of guys, they become hyper fixated with every sensation in their body, and they immediately have a panic anxiety response to it. And this can often lead them to making, emotional responses or derailing the protocol or really creating some issues. But I like to tell them, I'm like, look, this is going to be puberty 2.0. Like, this is going to be another hormone process. But now you're an adult with responsibilities. You've got, all the information in the world in the palm of your hand. This can really go haywire if you're not prepared to go through some change. And sometimes guys will freak out and they'll go, oh, this is changing, this is changing, this is changing. And I'm going, well, maybe you should frame this as, well, at least something's happening. I mean, if nothing was changing, then it wouldn't be working. So you kind of got to pick something, right? But it's exactly what you said. A lot of the estrogen issues that people are having when they're starting treatment, that they call estrogen issues, is part of the body getting with the program. There's a whole bunch of downstream enzymatic stuff that has to re-regulate and change. And that process, you're going to inhabit that. And that's going to be tricky. But the other thing that I found, and one of the, and I'm sure you're the same, one of the best things about working with so many people for so long is that you learn a bunch of stuff from just basically, you can show me a study saying the sky is green. I'm outside all day, every day, it's blue. And this kind of stuff we learn from TRT is that we're going, I'm in the trenches all the time. But one thing that's been a real blessing for me is, as you know, some co-founders have helped set up clinics that I'm very heavily involved with. I end up seeing 10 to 20 times more people per week because I'm doing asynchronous reviews of the blood work. So I'm seeing huge volumes now. And then trends become a lot more apparent because you're seeing a client's blood work every 5 minutes, not every 20 or 30 minutes. And the thing that I find really interesting, and the way that I've designed our questionnaires for follow-ups and feedback so that we can make some succinct recommendations for their conversation with the doctor, is around lifestyle factors. And if I had to correlate two variables almost perfectly, it would be alcohol consumption and side effects at 12 weeks. And then if I had to bring a couple of other variables into that equation, it's excess body fat and terrible diet. And the issue that I think people are having, and if you go on Reddit, the problem is that you can see all these genetic over aromatizers who don't have profile pictures. I think if they had profile pictures, very quickly work out that this is a body fat problem or an alcohol problem. I mean, how many of those guys would have a beer in their hand in their photos? So it can sometimes be a very tricky thing to change these habits, because a lot of these habits are maladaptive coping mechanisms from people feeling terrible for a long time. And they're now having to, kind of recognize and sometimes learn the hard way that this stuff's not serving them anymore. But I think that outside of protocols being terrible, like assuming that we're dealing with frequent injections and decent doses of testosterone, I think that half of the side effects come from the body adjusting to the protocol, and the other half come from the systemic inflammation from poor diet and lifestyle factors, as well as poor liver function, chronic pain, chronic inflammation, all of these things together. And then these guys, I think, are a real challenge, because one of the problems where, things kind of, the pendulum swings too far in each direction is people go, oh, well, it's not an estrogen issue. And it's going, okay, but it is an issue. Like there's still a problem here. So we need to fix this. So if we're not going to use aromatase inhibitors aren't the solution, it's like there has to still be a solution. Otherwise, you've just got a problem. So I think that's where it becomes case by case. And I think that it can be a matter of manipulating the protocol, making sure there's not things like hypothyroidism going on. I've never used NANDROLONE for something like this, but I'm very curious about that. But also for me, it's with my health coaching background, it's going, hey, we need to change the habits. And sometimes it can be, prescribing things like glutathione injections, giving people melatonin at night to help with sleep and to help modulate, inflammation and estrogen receptor availability. All of these things can be really helpful. But ultimately, it comes down to going, if you are putting the healthy amount of testosterone into a healthy man at a frequency that at least mimics natural production as closely as possible, it shouldn't cause problems. It should make you healthy. And that's just how the works. So I'd like to kind of hijack the conversation a little bit, like we spoke about before. I've always been curious about NANDROLONE, and I was curious about it originally because I'm a big fan, not a cult follower, but I'm a fan of Dr. Ray Peat's work. And I make that distinction very important. And he was very big on progesterone. So I was always very interested in NANDROLONE in terms of it being this anabolic compound that also had this progesterone or progestin-like effect. And the thing that I've never been able to understand, and I've looked at the research, and the research was, it was mentioning stuff, but it wasn't very clear. So what I'd be curious about is, well, actually two parts. One, is the pain relieving effect of NANDROLONE mediated by other mechanisms other than its role as a progestin, i.e. does it have any kind of unique opioid or anti-inflammatory functions outside of just increasing fluid in the joint? And then secondly, what kind of dose is typically well tolerated, both from not causing things like bloating or high blood pressure or mood side effects? And how does that kind of, in practice, what does that typically look like with TRT?
Yeah, great questions. And I can, luckily I have a lot of experience, and I've been able to resolve that experience with data and studies as well. And one of the problems is there's not a lot of studies done on nandrolone, and that's one of the problems, right? First of all, what I wanted to say is I loved what you said about the studies. You can show me a study that says the sky is green. I'm outside every day, the sky is blue. I say that a lot, and I frame it by saying that studies are interest and they should invoke further look into things. But what's more important is the empirical data. What do we actually see in the field? And that trumps anything that a study is going to tell you. And then when you said you can just start to see trends because you do this so much. And that's kind of what happened to me throughout the decades. I've successfully got over 20,000 people through the use of hormones. So I can sit on my mountaintop, look down on all the empirical data I've aggregated, and I can start to see these trends that other people can't. I can start to see how percentages of populations move with different things. And, because of my background too, I've done a lot of the derivatives, nandrolones, boldenone, oxandrolone, even methenolone. And that's another thing too. Methenolone, the fact that, well, in the United States anyways, that it's not FDA approved is a testament to how little the medical community understands these, because methenolone is incredibly beneficial and would really solve a lot of, especially like when people have the estrogenic issues, or it would really solve that. And methenolone is when we want to talk about a safe anabolic androgenic steroid that has a lower side effect profile than anything else. I mean, the fact that we don't use that is just silly. But I really loved what you said there, and I wanted to highlight that. Moving into nandrolone. So yeah, I've used nandrolone quite a bit. I've had thousands and thousands of people, and I've had a lot of success with it. And so one of the things that develops is the myth of decadic, right? And that's one of the first things people always say to me. And decadic just comes from a low estrogen issue. It does not convert to estrogen. So back in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, anabolic steroids were actually hard to come by, and people would take whatever they could get their hands on. So they would get their hands on a bottle of nandrolone and just take it by itself without understanding the need for the balance of testosterone and estrogen. So it would shut down their endogenous testosterone supply, therefore shut off the conversion to estrogen, and they'd have all this nandrolone with no estrogen. And then one of the classic symptoms of low estrogen is erectile dysfunction. So that's where the myth of decadic was born. On the contrary, when we use nandrolone properly with testosterone, because of its progestogenic nature, I usually actually get benefits in libido, benefits in erection quality, because it does have a 20% affinity to the progesterone receptor. Now, when I see blood tests and I see men with below 0.5 progesterone, I always say, okay, this is a problem. And like you, I wanted to start with pregnenolone. I want to try to see if we can get the steroidogenesis and get some progesterone in there with the use of pregnenolone first. It's important. It's acts on GABA receptors. It's kind of for an anti-anxiety. It also has to do erectile function, libido, and sensitivity as well. But we can also use nandrolone as a progestin to hit that function as well. So going further into its joint relief, and again, there is no study that clearly highlights this is the reason that nandrolone notoriously reduces joint pain, but it is absolutely undeniable that it does. There's way too much anecdotal data. I've seen it thousands upon thousands of times myself, and I've read about it 100,000 more times. Right? So there's no question that nandrolone does have significant joint pain relief. Some of the mechanisms that we have looked into, and I have a few that I think are probably the reason. One of them that I don't know if this is the reason or not, that it increases synovial fluid. Whether or not that's a progestogenic activity as well. And it's not proven that it increases synovial fluid. That's a theory, but that would make sense. It's just systemically anti-inflammatory. Systemically more anti-inflammatory than even testosterone is. Dr. Edward Lichten, so he pioneered some research on using anabolic steroids for inflammatory diseases. And he found that nandrolone was one of the most anti-inflammatory. And this is just through research and trial and error. And he used a lot of anabolic steroids to treat inflammatory diseases such as Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. These happen to be digestive, like autoimmune inflammatory diseases, but also rheumatoid arthritis. And he even found and wrote that nandrolone was one of the best at this. So just a systemically anti-inflammatory nature. Again, that's kind of what we're what's the reason for that? What I had been looking for for a long time was any evidence that nandrolone had some sort of agonization on the glucocorticoid receptor, because that would be it, right? That would explain it. And I found no evidence that nandrolone directly had agonized the glucocorticoid receptor, and I was hoping to, because that would be an easy answer. After studying this a lot and just over years and years of doing research, I finally found one study that did show that one of nandrolone's metabolites, progestin metabolites, does agonize glucocorticoid receptor. That's probably what I feel would do it the most. If we agonize the glucocorticoid system, then we would reduce inflammation to the point that we would have joint pain relief. Here's another thing, factor I found, and this could be, and it could be all these things together, right? It could be a little bit of all this together creates this system that really just helps pain. What I also found is that NOR19's nandrolone does have a small affinity for the estrogen receptor alpha. This would also explain why bodybuilders, so what would happen is bodybuilders would be taking a pretty high dose of testosterone, and then all of a sudden, and they'd be fine, right? Then they'd add a pretty high dose of nandrolone and they'd get gynecomastia. Now, the whole idea that nandrolone doesn't convert to estrogen, and we kind of show that. So some bodybuilders would say, well, it must convert to estradiol because I got gynecomastia when I added it. But, it's just, we prove over and over again that it does not. So then that's when the whole thing about prolactin. Well, something's got to be doing that. So maybe it's prolactin. And then that's when William Llewellyn had to disprove that nandrolone universally increased prolactin. It does not. It's actually rare that it does. So I found that nandrolone in high dose, right, it's a dose-dependent manner, will agonize the estrogen receptor alpha. And that makes the most sense. When we add a high, because it's really only high doses. When we have testosterone and we add a high dose of nandrolone, then some people who are sensitive to gynecomastia will get gynecomastia. And it's probably because it's directly agonizing the estrogen receptor. Now, that also could induce joint pain relief, estrogen receptor agonization. So it could be kind of all these things together that would do that. But I have had a lot of success with nandrolone as far as increasing people's sense of well-being, reducing anxiety, giving people increased libido, increased erection quality when used properly. It just has to be used properly. Every once in a while, and I would say it's even less than 1 out of 100, you have somebody who just does not react well to nandrolone. They have like mental anxiety effects, and it's rare, but every once in a while it does happen. Of course, those are the people who speak the loudest on TRT forums or forums. So everybody goes, oh, no, I read about that. And I was like, no, it really doesn't happen that often. If it does happen, you can just discontinue the nandrolone and you'll go back to normal. Everything will be fine. In fact, our friend Danny Bosa there was one that experienced that. He just couldn't take nandrolone without the mental side effects. But it's very rare that happens.
It's interesting. And it's a fascinating one for me as someone who's done a lot of research into progesterone in men, which is such a poorly understood subject.
Yeah.
And people often, bring across a whole bunch of the mechanisms of progesterone in women and then say, oh, that means that men should take the same dose of progesterone that women do. And it's like, well, that's like saying a woman should take a man's dose of testosterone. That's not. Yeah. It still has the same properties in the brain, and it is so integral for balance. And the way that I often explain progesterone in both men and women is that progesterone is kind of like the brain's version of Valium. It's a positive allosteric modulator of the GABA A receptor. And when you have a deficiency in that, it's kind of like you're having a Valium withdrawal all the time. Yeah. And it's one of the hormones that declines with age in men. And my general go-to for that has always been to optimize with pregnenolone, because that way, we know that pregnenolone predominantly converts into progesterone. It's like a 70% conversion. And that way the body can kind of pull from that what it needs as it needs it. And one of the things that I've found to be a game changer, and I always go back to Dr. Keith Nichols because he was right about a lot of things, and I used to kind of question, was that the sustained release use of pregnenolone, so like a sustained release capsule, allows the body to really create that optimal level of progesterone consistently without these kind of peaks and troughs. But I've always had this interest in nandrolone because I've met people, and only a small handful of them, because nandrolone's a bit tricky in Australia, but methenolone's not. And that's one of the good things about Australia is, like, I often joke that in the US, you guys only use Anavar therapeutically because you can't get methenolone. But methenolone's wonderful when it's used properly. I mean, that's you give someone 25 milligrams of methenolone. I've never seen that dysregulate any blood markers ever.
Me either.
It's so well tolerated. And so so beneficial, especially for these younger guys who really need a bit more of that androgenic kind of oomph. But when it comes to this nandrolone thing, the other thing that I'm really curious of is like, because when I've read the research on it, there's that one study, and I often joke that I'm like, you know, when we were doing our undergrad in science, and one thing that I'll kind of, you know, cover back on is that you referred to, but basically what I often say is that science is a tool that helps us understand the world. It's not a religion. Recently, people have started to worship it like it's a religion. And the whole point of the scientific method is to go, I've got this idea, let's attack it from every angle and see if it still holds up to be true. And that's basically the scientific method. And the thing that you learn when you study science, you know, when we do our first year, you know, Science 101 unit, they'd give you a study and they'd remove like the discussion, or they'd remove the abstract, or they'd remove the conclusion, and you had to fill in the blanks. And one thing that you learn when you do that exercise is you go, these studies are often a load of shit. They don't mean anything compared to what the author, like sometimes the author just gets it backwards, or they're weighting something that's just nonsense. Like it's just nonsense conclusions. And the thing that I've had trouble with for nandrolone is that you've got this one study that goes, we added 50% of the TRT dose in nandrolone to a TRT protocol, and then we measured people's self-reported pain relief. I'm like, that's barely a study. It's like we measured one thing and we did this kind of thing, and it was just like, okay, but what else happened? And they're like, well, we didn't look at that. So that, but you know, what they did look at is interesting. But then in all these other studies, I'm seeing 25 milligram per mil nandrolone decanoate administered every 2 to 3 weeks in HIV patients. So I'm sitting here being like, well, in these studies where they've used next to nothing, at least they've measured some kind of, you know, other blood markers. And then in the one that kind of represents the dosing that I see a lot of people doing online, they didn't really measure anything. So what kind of ballpark, like weekly, like starting dose, average dose, like what, or is there a dose that you start with and then you have to work it up to confer therapeutic benefit? Or is there a dose that if you go too high, it causes problems? Like what kind of, like, what does this really kind of look like in practice?
Yeah, that's another great question. So I think we attack it like we attack anything else. Start off at a low dose, and I've found that about 60 milligrams is where people can start to see the benefits of nandrolone, depending on what we've done with the testosterone. But it is an androgen. It will increase the total androgen load. So we want to watch that we're not going too high. So I have some people who they go up to like 250 testosterone per week, right? Now they start saying, man, these joint pains won't go away, or something to that effect. And so I say, okay, well, I think it makes sense, instead of just adding nandrolone on top of that, the androgen load's getting high, let's back off testosterone and then add nandrolone, right? So we'll just, even though testosterone is more anabolic than nandrolone, nandrolone is much less androgenic than testosterone. So even though it's not equal, I tend to start by reducing the testosterone dose by about 60 milligrams, 50, 60 milligrams, and then adding nandrolone at 60 milligrams. And then it's about the same thing we always do, titrate the dose of nandrolone up if necessary to continue to mitigate the side effects or continue to ease the joint pain. So, and I find that, you know, everybody's different, right? Some people, their magic number is 100 milligrams nandrolone. The classic thing that people say is you got to do a 2-to-1 ratio. And that's just, I mean, that's an okay start. Most people are just fine with a 1-to-1 ratio of testosterone and nandrolone. Again, it would have to do with total androgen load to the estrogen ratio, like what works for that person as an individual, and also the progestogenic activity. Like there can be too much. And also understand this, for people who are super sensitive to estrogen, we'll give more nandrolone than testosterone. I've had people who are so sensitive to testosterone and the estrogenic conversion that they can only use 50 milligrams per week of testosterone. And so then now that's just not enough androgens. They need more androgens, but they can't add testosterone. So then I'll put 100 milligrams of nandrolone on top of that. So now we're doing more nandrolone than testosterone. And for some people who are really sensitive to that estrogen, that works really, really well. For most people, you do want a 2-to-1 or a 1-to-1 ratio, but a 1-to-1 ratio doesn't necessarily confer problems. And sometimes it can. The extra progestogenic activity can start to cause erection quality problems or sensitivity problems. So it's about finding that ratio. So just like we do anything else, start off low, slowly titrate up until we find the dose that yields the best results for you as an individual. But it's very beneficial. I recommend the use of nandrolone for any kind of joint pain, or like I've had people who just having a little anxiety from testosterone, probably because it increases tyrosine kinase. Tyrosine kinase increases the catecholamines such as norepinephrine and epinephrine. The progestogenic effect can, like you said, it acts on the GABA receptors. It can kind of quiet the mind. It can kind of reduce anxiety. So I can use it for that function as well. But yeah, I have a lot of success with nandrolone. Like it adds and benefits people's protocol.
I think that the amazing thing about hormone replacement therapy is that, like, there's not really many painkillers you can use chronically that are good for you that are still going to maintain efficacy without you really pushing it up and creating issues. I mean, you've got NSA, which will destroy your gut. You've got paracetamol that will destroy your liver, or opioids, which will destroy your life. So, I mean, it's when you've got a tool in the toolbox to be like, hey, we've got something here that, I mean, and I think that's one of the wonderful things about this field is you don't need that many tools because the tools are so effective for so many things. But yeah, that's very interesting.
I've seen these compounds get so many people off of all other kinds of medications, including opioids for pain relief. I've seen nandrolone and testosterone combination get so many people off of opioids. I've done a few videos of people who were able to do just that. We did transformation stories of people who were in really bad injuries and were on opiates, and now they just use testosterone and nandrolone to control their pain, and they don't need opiates anymore. It's wonderful.
That was actually the catalyst that made me reach out to you before. For people listening, before we were recording, I was saying that one of the downsides of being so busy is you don't really watch much of this stuff in your free time because you just want to kind of watch something else. But one of the videos that I saw of yours outside of the previous one that I'd watched was, you were sharing like a case study of a guy and he was kind of going through like a pain log. And, as someone myself who's experienced a lot of chronic pain in my life from spinal injuries, like, when someone can sit there and be like, no, like this is like significantly better, from like a low out of 10 to like, 8 or 9 out of 10 pain relief from not having to use opioid medication or like massive doses of NSAIDs. I mean, that's miracle work for people who are suffering with that stuff.
Couldn't agree with you more. And that's why you and I are both in this field, because we've seen miracles. And just like you said, I love how you just put that. I'm probably going to steal that too. Is we have these tools in our toolbox, and we don't need too many tools, because it really, a lot of people hate when I say this, but it almost becomes a panacea for all of these disorders, for metabolic disorders, fatigue disorders, and a lot of pain as well, because we're really fixing the root of the problem. We're fixing the etiology from metabolic disorders and from fatigue disorders. Like, we're getting to the root of what's causing those. And it really is a great tool to, no matter what the etiology of those disorders are, these hormones can come in and fix it.
And the thing that kind of what you were talking about before with how, testosterone increases part of the tyrosine conversion, which for people listening is basically how dopamine gets made from amino acids. One of the things that I've learned from Dr. Keith, as well as Neil Rousier as well, is this idea of, if we optimize the hell out of one hormone, then it can often be really important that we optimize the other pathways of the body to be able to support this part of the body being optimal. I mean, I've used this analogy to death, but if you have a car that needs a service and then you supercharge the engine, then you're going to fix one problem but create a few more, because now there's further imbalance between these systems. And I think that sometimes one of the challenges for people in chronic pain or people with metabolic disorders is that we've taken a really healthy level of testosterone and put it in someone who's really unhealthy. And the process of getting them to be able to meet that medicine halfway in terms of getting healthier sometimes requires supporting more systems. And I think that this is where, if a guy's got low testosterone and low progesterone, then he might not really notice that because he just feels terrible anyway. But now if you jack the testosterone up, all of a sudden he's like, I feel better, but I'm overstimulated because now that low progesterone is now problematic because we fixed one thing, but we've now created this gap between the two.